Welcome back to the channel. Everything in this video is reconstructed from court records, police files, and published investigative journalism. No speculation, no embellishment. Today, the case of Jose Manuel Martinez. March 2013, a hayfield on the edge of Alabama's Bankhead National Forest. Hunters heard gunshots, distant and unremarkable. The kind of sound that barely registers in hunting country. Less than an hour later, they found the body. Tim McWhorter, chief investigator for the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office, a poor rural department where the entire investigative team numbered only a handful, stood over a dead man. Then he stopped cold. I know that guy. He'd once hired the man to re-roof his house. His name was Jose Ruiz. Standing there, McWhorter had no idea that Ruiz's death would lead him into one of the most staggering confessions in modern American criminal justice. The confession of a man who claimed to have killed more than 30 people across 12 states over 3 decades. He just knew a man he'd hired to fix his roof was never going to answer another phone call. But this isn't a story about the police finally getting good enough to catch him. It's a story about how many times he nearly got caught in California, in Florida, and how each time one small, very human detail let him walk away. A DNA match that sat forgotten in a file for 6 years, a polygraph that came back with a clear result and led to no charges. And in the end, the person who stopped him wasn't cutting-edge forensic technology. It wasn't an elite task force. It wasn't a breakthrough in investigative science. It was a sheriff's department, so small that to interrogate a suspect, they had to borrow the high school Spanish teacher as an interpreter. This is that story, not the story of a manhunt won by superior skill, but the story of a system that came close to the truth again and again and let it slip, until the one thing it couldn't out-resource or outmaneuver finally caught up to him. Lawrence County sits in the northwest corner of Alabama, a landscape of farmland, 2-lane roads, and small towns where everybody knows everybody. Tim McWhorter grew up there. His father had been in law enforcement. Tim followed him into the job right out of high school, starting at 19 as a jailer, then a school resource officer, then a patrol deputy, and finally, chief investigator. In his 7 years in that role, he took pride in one fact. There hadn't been a single homicide in his county his team couldn't solve. It wasn't a boast so much as a habit of mind. In a place this small, you don't get to hide behind an unsolved case. Everyone knows whose file it is. The Jose Ruiz case would test this in ways McWhorter couldn't have imagined. Ruiz was friends with a man named Jaime Romero, who was dating the daughter of a man named Jose Manuel Martinez. On March 4th, 2013, Ruiz got into a truck with Romero and a third man, an older, likable father figure in the middle of an extended visit to see his daughter from California. The 3 men drove south through towns that grew smaller and smaller until the pavement gave way to an old-growth forest of Bankhead. Only 2 of the men came back. The case moved fast, faster than most homicides McWhorter had worked. Next to the body, deputies found a Walmart receipt, an ordinary throwaway piece of paper that turned out to be the thread that unraveled everything. Store security cameras led them to footage of Romero. They found Ruiz's truck parked in a lot in Decatur, and another camera angle showing a truck pulling up alongside it, not long before the murder. The plate came back to Romero. Every piece of evidence pointed in one direction, cleanly, almost too cleanly. Jaime's the guy that done this, McWhorter remembers thinking. On March 11, McWhorter's team traced Romero to Martinez's daughter's house and arrested him. This is the point where a lot of cases close on the wrong man. Strong physical evidence, a plausible suspect, a tidy story. If Martinez hadn't walked into the sheriff's office that day, the story might have ended right there. The wrong man charged, the real killer back in California. But Martinez did walk in. He showed up, looking every bit the devoted father, worried about his daughter's boyfriend. He swore Romero had been with him at the time of the murder. McWhorter, like nearly every officer who met Martinez before and after, found himself won over by how genuine he seemed. But one moment made him pause. Near the end of the conversation, maybe just making small talk, McWhorter asked whether Martinez found people in Alabama more courteous than folks in California. For the most part, yes, Martinez said. But he'd recently had a bad encounter. Dropping his granddaughter off at school, distracted while waving goodbye, he bumped into another parent. She refused his apology and told him to watch where he was going. McWhorter still remembers exactly what Martinez said next. I looked at her and said, "Bitch, get out of my way." You could see the anger, McWhorter recalled. It was like somebody flipped a switch. In a single sentence, the friendly face was gone. It lasted only a moment. Martinez caught himself, smiled again, and then went back to being the easygoing grandfather McWhorter had been talking to a minute earlier. But McWhorter had seen it now, and he couldn't unsee it. At the time, though, he didn't know what to do with that instinct. He had no evidence, just a feeling. The kind that doesn't hold up in a courtroom no matter how sure it makes you. The real evidence came from somewhere else. A month after his arrest, still facing murder charges, Romero asked to speak with McWhorter alone. He didn't speak English, and the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office had no one who spoke Spanish. So, McWhorter called in the local high school's Spanish teacher, who also happened to be the football coach, to interpret. I want to tell you the whole story, Romero said. He wasn't the killer. The man who did this was the one who had vouched for him, his girlfriend's father, Jose Martinez. McWhorter thought back to that flash of anger in the school parking lot. Maybe, he thought, Romero was just pointing the finger to save himself. But he called California anyway. What he learned didn't put him at ease. Martinez had a drug-related criminal record. He'd once been a person of interest in a shooting years earlier, and just as McWhorter hung up the phone, word came back. Martinez had left the state, likely for Mexico. We knew as far as conviction, we were lacking a whole lot, McWhorter admitted later. This is the decision that shapes everything that follows. Not a dramatic moment, but a quiet administrative choice. Easy to overlook if nothing had come of it. McWhorter decided to seek a warrant anyway. This is all we've got. This is where we're at, and I think we owe it to the victim's family to try, he told his superiors. If it fails, we're gonna fail trying. Sheriff Gene Mitchell agreed. His reasoning, he explained later, was simple. Letting a killer walk free just because you're afraid of looking bad in court with a weak witness, that just isn't justice. The warrant was issued. It was a gamble, with real professional risk attached. If the case fell apart in front of a jury, it would be McWhorter's name on the failed prosecution, not just the department's. But he filed it anyway. Nobody at the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office knew that 1,000 miles away, in 2 other states, that there had already been chances to stop this man years earlier. In Tulare County, California, flat, sun-baked farm country, where Martinez was born and raised, the name El Mano Negra, the Black Hand, had been quietly circulating for years before Alabama ever heard it. Local police knew Martinez. They'd arrested him repeatedly on minor charges. They suspected him in at least 4 murders in the area. They'd even questioned him. But they had never charged him with murder. In March 2010, after finishing a stretch for a parole violation, Martinez did something strange, something almost nobody in his position would do. He walked into the Tulare County Sheriff's Violent Crimes Unit himself to ask for his Chevrolet Suburban back, seized when he'd been a suspect of an earlier killing. He didn't have to go in person. He could have sent a lawyer or simply written the vehicle off. Instead, he walked through the front door of the unit built to investigate him, and he offered to talk further about what he knew. Detective Cesar Fernandez seized the opening. He asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph about who had killed a man named Joaquin Barragan. Martinez agreed. He was asked whether he knew who had killed Barragan. He said no. Result? Deception indicated. A second test focused directly on whether he himself had pulled the trigger. He said no. Result? Deception indicated again. A second examiner reviewed the results independently, without knowing the first examiner's conclusion, and agreed. 2 tests, 2 examiners, the same answer both times. Martinez, however, was never charged. This wasn't some minor technical gap easily explained away as bad luck. This was a moment when the justice system came remarkably close to the truth, looked at it straight in the face, and stopped. Asked why they didn't act further, a department spokesperson said, "They don't move forward until a case is thoroughly investigated, since an arrest starts a 48-hour clock to arraignment." The prosecutor on this case explained it this way. In essence, ethically, they couldn't charge anyone in California unless they believed they could prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a legitimate legal standard. No prosecutor should file charges they can't prove. But it also meant this: a man who had just failed 2 consecutive polygraphs about a murder walked free from the very building where he'd failed them, and went on to kill at least 1 more person before he was ever caught, 3 states away. A relative of Barragan's later told a reporter, unable to hide the bitterness, they let him go, and he kept on killing. Nearly 2,500 miles away in Florida, a different failure, quieter but maybe more consequential, was already unfolding. In November 2006, 2 men, Javier Huerta, 20 years old, and a co-worker, Gustavo Olivares, were shot to death. Their bodies left in a pickup truck at the edge of the Ocala National Forest. Police quickly recognized it as a drug hit. Huerta was suspected of stealing 10 kilos of cocaine. Inside the truck, detectives found a Mountain Dew can. Inside the can, a cigarette butt. They bagged it as evidence and sent it to the lab. In theory, it should have produced a match almost immediately. Martinez's fingerprints and DNAs were already on file from prior drug arrests, but the DNA results never made it back to the sheriff's office. Nobody noticed. For 6 years. 6 years, while a case file sat in a cabinet with the answer already inside of it. 6 years, during which Martinez killed at least 4 more people, possibly 6. Not until 5 o'clock in the afternoon on October 9th, 2012, when detectives at the Marion County Sheriff's Office, working overtime to review cold cases, reopened the file marked Huerta. Did anyone discover that part of the evidence, including that cigarette butt, had never been fully tested? They sent the request back to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's crime lab. On February 27, 2013, 6 years after the cigarette butt was collected, and just days before Martinez would kill Jose Ruiz in Alabama, Detective T.J. Watts finally got the results. A match. Jose Manuel Martinez, once held in a California jail 2,000 miles from the Ocala National Forest. But at that moment, nobody, not even Watts, knew they just found the first thread leading to one of the most prolific serial killers in modern American history. To Watts, sitting at his desk with a lab report in his hand, it was just a DNA match, with no clear explanation for why a California Paralease cigarette butt had turned up in a truck in Florida. By this point, the American justice system had already had at least 2 real chances to stop Martinez years before he ever set foot in Alabama. A polygraph in California that came back clear, a correct DNA match sitting forgotten in a Florida file for 6 years. Not because Martinez was too clever to catch, though he liked to believe that about himself. Because justice, it turns out, runs on people, with limited budgets, limited time, and small administrative decisions that can let a man keep killing for years without anyone connecting the dots. Just days after the Florida DNA results finally came back, Martinez returned to Alabama. On March 4th, 2013, 5 days after the Florida DNA match was confirmed, Martinez killed Jose Ruiz in that hayfield outside Bankhead. Afterward, he went home to California to stay with his mother. Then in April, police showed up at his door in early March, but not about Ruiz, but over a separate investigation into a string of drug-related robberies. Martinez, the Alabama killing still fresh, bolted out the back door. He didn't need to run. The police knew nothing about Alabama. They only wanted to ask him about illegal ammunition possession, a minor parole violation. They could have held him. Instead, they let him go, on a promise that he'd help them with the robbery case. By mid-May, Martinez was getting restless. He swapped cars twice to avoid being tracked, then drove 300 miles to the border. He crossed into Mexico, a country that rarely extradites murder suspects to the United States, especially ones facing a life sentence or the death penalty. For a moment, it really was only a moment. Martinez was free and clear, back in a country where 33 years of killing had never once caught up with him. But he'd left behind a living witness, and that was the mistake that would end him. On May 17, 2013, Martinez walked back across the border at San Luis Rio Colorado in the Mexican state of Sonora. A routine records check turned up the warrant McWhorter had just filed. They told me I had a warrant for murder, Martinez recalled. I said, "Warrant from where?" He was taken to jail in Yuma, Arizona, to await extradition to Alabama. McWhorter and another investigator flew out to collect him. On the flight home, they deliberately avoided asking him about the case, instead making small talk about life, the military, and the surprisingly good pizza during a refueling stop in Lubbock, Texas. It was a strange, almost ordinary few hours. 2 cops and a confessed killer talking like old acquaintances at 30,000 feet. McWhorter was struck by how unbothered Martinez seemed, as if being arrested for murder was no big deal at all. When they arrived at the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office, Detective T.J. Watts from Florida was already there, waiting to question Martinez about his own case. McWhorter told him he'd have to wait. "No hard feelings, buddy, but you got DNA. We need a confession," McWhorter told him, practically shutting down the interview room door in his face. Neither man expected Martinez to confess to anything. McWhorter figured, at best, Martinez would tell him to pound sand and sit in jail, maybe slip up eventually on a recorded call. The best case scenario, he thought, was that Martinez might admit to being at the scene while pinning the whole thing on Romero. Instead, Martinez confessed to killing Ruiz almost immediately. "You guys have been real respectful to me, and I appreciate that," he said. "Do you want me to tell you the truth?" McWhorter nodded. "Yeah. I killed that son of a bitch." Martinez's eyes, friendly just minutes before, went cold and dark. "He said some bad stuff about my daughter. I stand up for my family. I don't let anyone talk about my family." This is the answer to the question that's been hanging since the beginning of this video. Why a mild-mannered roofer ended up dead in a remote hayfield? Not drugs, not money, an insulting comment, which Martinez, with a logic of violence built over 30 years in the business, decided was worth a man's life. It's a small, almost pathetic motive for the crime that finally brought down one of the deadliest hired killers in the country. McWhorter barely had time to sit with that before Martinez delivered something far bigger. I've killed over 35 men in my life. After letting Watts take a turn, Martinez confessed to the Florida murders too, describing the scene and the number of shots fired in detail, telling Watts that if he hadn't done the job, somebody else would have. Then he said he wanted to get some things off his chest about California as well. He asked for Crystal Darrington, the deputy who'd once driven him in for questioning back in early March. When she walked into the interview room, Martinez smiled and politely asked about her trip. Then he got straight to the point. He was a hired killer. Darrington's texts back to headquarters in Visalia came fast and constant. Victims' names, dates, descriptions of roads, orchards, and drainage ditches where Martinez said he'd left bodies, delivered in the same unhurried tone he might have used to describe a road trip. One victim after another, faster than she could keep up, faster than anyone in that room could quite process in real time. Detectives flew in from state after state to hear him talk, notebooks out, half expecting to catch him in a lie. Many were skeptical at first. Was he really responsible for all of it, or just building himself a reputation the way inmates sometimes do? But again and again, even for cases 30 years old, Martinez remembered details only the killer would know. The make of the car, the caliber of the gun, even the number of shell casings left at the scene. The location, the kind of car he was driving, the caliber, even the shell casings, McWhorter recalled. You found this many shell casings at the scene, he'd say. Officers would step out of the room shaking their heads, comparing notes with each other in the hallway. Dead on, every single time. He didn't remember his victims' names. He didn't know how many kids they had, or what they did for a living, or who was waiting up for them the nights they didn't come home. But he was certain, without ever offering proof, that every one of them deserved it. In his mind, every victim had hurt a woman or a child, and that was the only fact about them that mattered to him. He told me he had never killed a good person, McWhorter recalled. 36 lives, reduced to a number he recited almost casually. But when asked about guilt, his answer revealed more than any body count ever could. Detective Scott Logue from Tulare asked him directly, did he have any remorse for what he'd done? Martinez leaned forward. What does that mean? Are you sorry? He nodded, like a student remembering the right answer. Yes. Yesterday the priest came and talked to me. How about before the priest came? Were you sorry? No, he said flatly, looking Logue in the eye. I hated those guys. But the real question was never why Martinez killed for 30 years without getting caught. The real question is, after 30 years of absolute silence he'd maintained through at least 2 serious investigations, silence he'd maintained under a failed polygraph, why did he choose to confess everything to the smallest, least resourced sheriff's department he'd ever encountered? The answer lies in the very thing that made him kill Reese in the first place. While hiding out in Mexico, enjoying a stretch on the coast of the Sea of Cortez, Martinez heard that Alabama police were planning to call one of his granddaughters in for questioning about the case. He couldn't stand the thought. My family don't have to pay for any of the stupid things I've done in my life, he insisted. He left the safest hideout he'd ever had and turned himself back over to a murder warrant because he couldn't accept the idea of his granddaughter being interrogated. This is the chilling paradox at the center of this whole story. The same instinct to protect family that turned him into a killer in the first place. As a teenager, avenging the death of his sister, Cecilia Martinez, in the late 70s, was the same instinct that more than 30 years later made him kill Ruiz over an insult to his daughter. Now, that same instinct turned against him. The one thing strong enough to finally make him stop after everything else in the system had failed to. Not justice, not investigative technology, not an elite task force. The love for a granddaughter he couldn't bear to see sitting in an interrogation room. That's what it took. In June 2014, in a Lawrence County courtroom, Martinez pleaded guilty to killing Jose Ruiz. Sentence? 50 years. Romero's defense attorney, representing a man who'd been wrongly suspected, couldn't hide her frustration. Paula Bassam believed it was a case they could have won, and that Romero should never have come under that level of suspicion. District Attorney Eric Jed said he saw it differently. They had a solid conviction, and they knew Martinez would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Nobody in that courtroom that day, not the judge, not the attorneys, not McCorder himself, knew this was only the first of 3 sentences still to come. In September 2014, Martinez was extradited to California to face 9 murder charges and 1 attempted murder, spanning 3 counties: Tulare, Kern, and Santa Barbara, and covering more than 3 decades, from 1980 to 2011. In October of 2015, he pleaded guilty to all of them. A month later, the court handed down the sentence: 10 consecutive life terms. In the courtroom that day was Aseneth Moreno, daughter of Juan Bautista Moreno, one of the victims killed in 2009 near McFarland. She'd waited 6 years to face her father's killer. Growing up, I always wanted to be in the same room as him just so he could feel something, she told reporters. I'm not sure if he did, knowing his story, but who knows if he cares about anything. She wanted something else too, to clear her father's name. The Tulare County District Attorney publicly confirmed that Juan Bautista Moreno had no cartel ties whatsoever. He may have simply owed the wrong person money. It's a detail easy to lose among the shocking number. 36, 12 states, 3 decades. But it may be one of the most important facts in the entire case. Most of Martinez's victims weren't notorious drug criminals. They were farm workers, construction workers, ordinary men. Some who owed money to the wrong person or said the wrong thing at the wrong time. And for years, the label drug criminal, deserved or not, seemed to have meant their cases got less attention. Fewer detectives assigned, fewer hours logged. That label outlived the men it was pinned to. It followed them into the case files, and in some cases, it took a courtroom decades later to finally take it back off. Prosecutor David Alavesos, who handled the California cases, defended his office's cautious approach. Ethically, he said, they couldn't charge anyone in California unless they believed they could prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a sound principle for a fair justice system. The same principle that protects the innocent from being railroaded by a thin case. But civil rights attorney Marguerite Mello, a former Tulare County prosecutor herself, offered a sharper view. In this county, she said, there's no question Latino residents are treated differently than white residents. None of those victims matter to the system the same way. If Martinez had been killing people with a stronger voice in the community, she argued, resources would have followed, and he would have been caught much sooner. Scott Logue, the retired Tulare assistant sheriff who once ran the violent crimes unit, pushed back hard against that reading of the events. He said it didn't matter to them what nationality or gender a victim was. For years, he said, plenty of detectives were desperate to make a case against Martinez stick. A lot of sweat and tears went into those investigations, even when it didn't produce an arrest. Both things can be true at once. Detectives genuinely tried, case after case, year after year, in a system with limited resources and a high burden of proof, and a region overwhelmed by drug crime, still let a killer slip through for more than 30 years. Effort and outcome don't always line up. That gap, more than any single villain, is where most of this story actually lives. The final sentence came from Florida, and this was where justice came closest to its outer limit. In June 2019, already serving 10 life sentences, Martinez stood trial in Marion County for the 2006 killings in Ocala, Javier Huerta and Gustavo Olivares. Florida was the only state where prosecutors believed they could secure the death penalty. It took the jury less than half an hour to find Martinez guilty of cold premeditated murder. Then the trial moved to sentencing. Prosecutor Amy Burns reenacted several of his murders, forming her fingers into the shape of a gun. Detectives from multiple states played video of his confessions. But the defense had a different strategy. Nearly 20 family members flew in to tell the jury about a father, an uncle, a grandfather who had sacrificed for them. Trips to Disneyland, sleepless nights nursing a sick grandchild, quiet checks handed over for medical bills. His sister, Patricia Martinez, described how he'd protected her since childhood. "He's been more than a brother. He's my guardian," she said. "I'm alive because of him. He took beatings for us. He fed us. He saved me." The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Not long for a decision about whether a man should live or die. The verdict? No death penalty. 2 more consecutive life sentences added to the 10 he already had, a number by then almost too large to mean anything. Defense attorney John Spivey summed up the case in one image: a cold-blooded killer executing people for money for more than 30 years, set against a genuinely devoted father, uncle, grandfather. 2 true versions of the same man, presented to 12 strangers who had to decide which one determined his fate. In the end, Spivey said, the human side outweighed the monster side. Cecilia Camacho, widow of David Belola, the first of Martinez's murder-for-hire victims killed in 1980, wasn't in the courtroom for sentencing. She had remarried, raised more children, spent decades picking oranges to put them through school. For 30 years, she never knew why her husband had been shot to death on his way to work. 30 years of not knowing. And then, in a single afternoon, knowing everything. When she heard the jury had spared Martinez's life, her response carried the weight of decades of grief, not anger. Whatever sentence they handed down, her husband was never coming back. No verdict was ever going to change that math. 3 sentences, handed down in 3 different courtrooms, in 3 different states. 12 confirmed murders in total, through guilty pleas and jury verdicts. But the number Martinez claimed for himself, 36 people across 12 states, is still out there. Most of it never verified. He claimed victims in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Missouri, Colorado, Georgia, Iowa, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. 9 states beyond Alabama and California and Florida. Not one of those claims ever led to an indictment. When McWhorter tried reaching out to police in the places Martinez said he'd left the bodies, most weren't interested. One officer in Seattle he recalled just laughed and said they'd had 25 murders in the last 6 months. As for the first 3 victims, the ones Martinez claimed to have killed in the late 1970s, avenging his sister's death, there will never be a conviction for them. Martinez has never revealed where their bodies are, and probably never will. He said more than once that those particular bones don't deserve to be found. The Riverside County Sheriff's Office has confirmed it still has an open homicide investigation into the death of Cecilia Martinez, decades old now, and that it's aware of the claims that her brother took revenge on the men responsible. However, it has never been able to substantiate them. That's one of the many gaps this case leaves behind. Not for a lack of effort. It's because of what the case fundamentally is. One man holding the truth about 36 deaths, willing to only share what he wants, when he wants. He's under no legal obligation to ever share the rest, no matter how many families are still waiting on the other end of that silence. Tim McWhorter made less than $50,000 a year. His department had to borrow the high school Spanish teacher to interview the suspect. It had never handled anything close to a case this size, and yet later, he reflected on an irony that still seems to astonish him, even after everything. "You've been in all these big cities and never been caught," he'd once told Martinez. "And you come to Lawrence County, Alabama, and you get caught." Martinez just laughed. He told them, the small town cop, not to get too full of himself. 33 years, a dozen states, and every police department that had ever come close. And the thing that finally brought him down wasn't better policing. It was one rare mistake in his entire career. He left a witness alive. He planned to kill Romero too to avoid leaving a witness behind, but he changed his mind at the last second. The one act of restraint in 33 years of violence that ended up costing him everything. If he'd gone through with it, there's a real chance no one would ever have connected him to Reese at all, and he'd still be out there, or in Mexico, uncaught. Today, 12 families know what happened to the people they lost, even if justice arrived decades late. Late enough that some of them had already stopped believing an answer would ever come. But if Martinez was telling the truth, and so far nearly everything he has said has checked out, down to the smallest, most unverifiable sounding detail, there may be 24 more families scattered across other states, still waiting for an answer that may never come. Because for most of them, no one, in any state, in any department, is looking anymore. If this video helped you see the case a little differently, not just as a body count, but as a story about the very human gaps that let it drag on for so long, leave a comment. Let us know what stood out to you the most. And subscribe for more cases like this one, where the facts always come first and the people behind them are never just a statistic. See you next time.